There are parts of you you've never met, but they know you. They remember every moment you tried to forget. They whisper in your choices, echo in your silences, and move your hands when you think you're in control. You tell yourself you're thinking clearly, that your decisions are rational, logical, chosen. But what if they're not? What if your entire life is being choreographed by something you can't see, a hidden intelligence beneath your awareness, sculpted by pain, repetition, memory, and silence? Carl Jung called it the unconscious. And he didn't mean a vague mental space of forgotten things. He meant the real you, the parts that don't speak in words, but through patterns, dream slips of the tongue, sudden emotions that appear without warning. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Most people don't realize that what feels like fate is often just a cycle, an inner program you didn't write, but still obey. You think you're choosing the same kind of partner over and over. You think you're attracted to a type, but you're not. You're repeating a story, trying to rewrite an old chapter that didn't end right. Maybe it's the unavailable person, the critical one, the one who mirrors your wounds. The unconscious doesn't seek happiness. It seeks familiarity. And if betrayal is familiar, it will feel like home. If abandonment shaped your childhood, distance will feel like safety. And every time you get close to love, your unconscious flinches. Not because it's wrong, but because it remembers the price you paid the last time you trusted. You can tell yourself you've moved on, but the unconscious doesn't believe words. It watches your behavior. It sees who you text when you feel worthless, who you avoid when you feel seen. It sees the mask you wear to function, the smile that hides confusion, the kindness that hides resentment, the strength that hides exhaustion. It sees everything, but it waits, silently, until it's triggered. That's how it speaks, not through thoughts, but through reactions. The tight chest, the sudden rage, the withdrawal that comes out of nowhere. You think you're reacting to the present, but more often than not, you're reacting to the past, to something unresolved that looks like today, but smells like yesterday. A voice tone, a facial expression, a delay in someone's reply. Your conscious mind doesn't catch it, but the unconscious does, and it pulls the alarm. And just like that, you're not you anymore. You're 5 years old again, begging not to be ignored. Or you're 12, trying to be perfect so they don't leave. Or you're 16, shutting down because opening up got you hurt. The past isn't behind you. It lives in your nervous system. It lives in your reactions. And it doesn't die with time. It hides in repetition. Until you notice. This is why Jung didn't believe in curing symptoms. He believed in decoding them. Every anxiety, every depression, every self-sabotaging behavior is a message, not a malfunction. Your unconscious isn't trying to destroy you. It's trying to protect you, even if its methods are outdated, even if they hurt you. Now they were created in a time when they were your only form of survival. And you never updated the code. You want to stop sabotaging your relationships, but you still believe you're not worth being chosen. You want to stop overthinking, but you still believe that one mistake will make them leave. You want to feel peace, but your unconscious doesn't trust peace. It thinks silence is the calm before the storm. That rest is weakness. That happiness is a trap. And so you keep running, performing, managing perceptions, controlling chaos before it controls you. But eventually something breaks. A moment, a person, a loss, a truth, something slips through the cracks, and the unconscious surges forward like a flood. You cry without knowing why. You panic over something small. You feel disconnected from yourself. And that's not the beginning of madness. It's the beginning of awareness. The unconscious is not a problem. It's a mirror. But it doesn't show you what you want to see. It shows you what you've buried. And for most people, that's unbearable. That's why we numb it, distract it, silence it. We scroll, we drink, we keep busy, we chase success. Anything to avoid sitting in the quiet where the real self waits. The self you abandoned to survive. The self who still wonders, when will you come back for me? The real tragedy is not that we are wounded. It's that we forget we are, that we wear our trauma like a second skin and call it personality, that we confuse coping with identity, that we build entire lives on top of buried pain, careers, relationships, reputations, and never notice the ground beneath us is shaking. But the unconscious doesn't forget, and eventually it finds a way to speak. Through dreams, through breakdowns, through repeating crises, not to punish you, but to wake you. Because deep down, you were never meant to live half alive. You were never meant to function like a machine. You were meant to feel, to remember, to return. You think you know who you are, but most of what you call you is a negotiation. A mask crafted in childhood, refined through rejection, shaped by fear, and hardened through experience. Jung called it the persona, the social face we wear to survive the demands of the world. It's the you that smiles when it wants to cry. The you that stays silent to avoid confrontation. The you that performs competence to hide collapse. And it works until it doesn't. The deeper truth is this: the persona is not you. It's your camouflage. It's the version of yourself you believed the world would tolerate. And behind it lives your real self, fragmented, hidden, silenced. Not because you're deceptive, but because the unconscious knows what you had to do to be safe. Maybe you learned early that anger is dangerous, that sadness is weakness, that joy must be dimmed so others aren't uncomfortable. So your unconscious adjusted. It tucked those parts away, not erased, just buried. Buried beneath obedience, achievement, charm, detachment. You became who you needed to be. And slowly you forgot who you really were. But the forgotten self never disappears. It waits. And it leaks. In dreams, in fantasies, in self-sabotage. In the sudden mood swings that make no logical sense. You're not crazy, you're full. Full of unlived life, of unspoken truths, of feelings you weren't allowed to feel. And the unconscious will find a way to remind you, even if it has to unravel your perfectly constructed identity to do it. That's why the deeper work isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering, peeling back the mask, listening to the parts of you that were silenced for too long. The child who was told to grow up, the rebel who was told to behave, the artist who was told to be practical, the lover who was told not to feel too much. The pain isn't in who you are. The pain is in who you had to stop being. And here's the paradox: the unconscious isn't just made of pain. It's made of power. Because what you repress doesn't just go away, it transforms. Your rage, when integrated, becomes boundary. Your grief, when honored, becomes compassion. Your fear, when faced, becomes intuition. Jung didn't see the unconscious as a dark dungeon. He saw it as a buried kingdom, a vast symbolic terrain that holds not only our wounds, but our wholeness. The archetypes live here: the lover, the warrior, the orphan, the sage. These are not roles you play. They are energies you carry. Universal patterns encoded in your psyche waiting to be embodied. And when they are denied, they turn against you. The rejected lover becomes obsession. The ignored warrior becomes self-harm. The unheard sage becomes cynicism. We do not escape the unconscious, we live it, whether consciously or not. That's why individuation, Jung's word for true psychological growth, is not self-improvement. It's self-integration. The process of reclaiming all the lost fragments, not to fix yourself, but to become whole. You are not just light, you are shadow. You are not just reason, you are instinct. You are not just what they loved, you are also what they couldn't handle. And all of it belongs. But this journey demands honesty. Radical, unflinching honesty. You have to admit when you're pretending. You have to recognize when your kindness is a mask for fear. When your independence is a mask for mistrust. When your busyness is a mask for emptiness. Most people don't want to see this, because it shatters their identity. But Jung warned, the greatest danger is not the shadow itself. It's the refusal to see it. So ask yourself, who did I have to become to be accepted? What parts of me were left behind in that bargain? What truths do I still flinch from? Because until you answer those questions, your life will not be your own. It will be a performance, a repetition, a projection of old fears onto new people. You'll think they betrayed you, but it was your unconscious reenacting the same story, hoping this time someone will choose you, protect you, stay. But no one can do that for you. Not fully, because the one you're waiting for is you. And the unconscious knows this. It keeps sending signals through pain, through conflict, through patterns, not to punish you, but to call you back. To the self you abandoned. To the self that remembers. To the self that is still whole beneath it all. This is not easy work. It will feel like dying. Because in a way it is. The death of illusion. The death of the false self. But what's born in its place is not weakness. It's freedom, quiet, sacred freedom. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind that doesn't perform. The kind that lives from the inside out, no longer controlled by invisible strings. Most people aren't living, they're reenacting. Reenacting old wounds, old dynamics, old betrayals. A child who was unseen becomes an adult who needs constant validation. A teen who was punished for speaking the truth becomes someone who lies to avoid conflict. A heart that was broken too early becomes a soul that flinches at softness. We wear the past like a second skin, and we call it personality. But what we really carry is unexamined survival. The unconscious is not abstract. It shows up in who you fall for, in who you avoid, in what makes you angry, in what makes you shut down. It shows up in the career you chase, in the compliments that feel false, in the silence that terrifies you. You think you're choosing, but how much of your life is actually chosen and how much is reaction? There is a pattern inside you, a map made of memory. And if you haven't made it conscious, it is leading your life. It decides who you let close, who you push away, who you don't trust. Not because they did anything wrong, but because they resemble someone who did. You don't see them, you see the ghost of someone else. And this is the danger of an unconscious life. That everyone becomes a mirror, but you don't know what you're reflecting. This is how love turns into fear, how intimacy becomes threat. The unconscious doesn't know time. It responds to a moment today as if it's 20 years ago. A tone of voice, a missed message, a change in body language. To someone else, it's nothing. To your unconscious, it's war. It's betrayal. It's abandonment. And so you defend. You attack. You withdraw. Not from now, but from then. And the other person stands confused, hurt, trying to understand why you overreacted. But how do you explain that the wound isn't new, that it's a reopened scar from another life? You can't. Because you may not even realize it yourself. That's how unconsciousness isolates you. It creates a gap between what you feel and what you understand. And in that gap, relationships die. Opportunities collapse. Dreams go unlived. You sabotage what you want, not because you don't deserve it, but because part of you still believes you're not allowed to have it. This is not a flaw. This is a signal. The unconscious is begging to be seen. But instead, we numb. We analyze instead of feel. We intellectualize instead of grieve. We blame instead of look inward. Because to sit with what's really there, the rage, the sorrow, the longing, is to face everything you've worked so hard to suppress. And the unconscious doesn't care how strong you are. It will keep showing up, louder, darker, sharper, until it breaks through the surface. Breakdowns are not failures. They are ruptures, necessary cracks in the mask. Moments when the unconscious demands to be heard. Not to destroy you, to save you. Because sometimes falling apart is the only honest thing you can do. It's the psyche's last resort when silence becomes unbearable. Jung believed that neurosis, anxiety, depression, compulsions were not random disorders. They were symbols. He said, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. We get sick when we refuse to suffer consciously, when we avoid grief, when we bury anger, when we pretend the past didn't shape us. And so the pain finds another way to speak, through the body, through behaviors, through dreams. But in this lies a strange gift. If suffering is symbolic, then healing can be conscious. If you dare to listen to the unconscious, it will guide you. It knows where the wound is, and it knows what you need. But it will not shout. It whispers, in quiet knowing, in gut feelings, in dreams that disturb you, in patterns that frustrate you. These are not obstacles. They are keys. Integration begins with recognition, with asking, what part of me is speaking right now? Is it the wounded child, the abandoned lover, the silenced voice? Don't try to get rid of them. They don't need fixing. They need witnessing. That's how the unconscious transforms. Not through suppression, but through inclusion. You bring the lost pieces home. You say, I see you. I hear you. I won't exile you again. But make no mistake, this is dangerous work. To wake up from the unconscious is to walk through fire. It's to watch the house you built on survival start to burn. It's to lose who you thought you were. And in that emptiness, you will be tempted to go back, to numb again, to pretend. But if you stay, if you let it burn, you will find something deeper than identity. You will find truth. Not a truth someone else gave you. Not a truth rooted in performance. But a raw, sacred knowing that comes from within. A stillness that doesn't need permission. A self that doesn't need validation. That is the power of making the unconscious conscious. You stop reacting and start choosing. You stop repeating and start remembering. You stop living someone else's story and start writing your own. There comes a moment when the silence is no longer peaceful. When the mask you've worn starts to suffocate you. When the same arguments, the same breakdowns, the same unanswered questions become unbearable. Not because they're new, but because you finally see them. You finally see the loops. The people who change, but the pain that doesn't. The different faces, but the same emptiness. That is the moment the unconscious steps into the light, not as a monster, but as a mirror. And what you see is not terrifying. It's familiar. Because it's you. The you who's been waiting to be remembered. This is the reckoning to realize that most of your life wasn't lived, it was reenacted. That what you thought was your personality was often just your protection. That what you thought was destiny was repetition. That the world didn't shape you, your unconscious did, and it shaped the world you were willing to see. When Jung spoke of individuation, he wasn't offering a new self-help method. He was offering a death and a rebirth. The death of the unconscious life. The rebirth of wholeness. But most people never make it. They stay asleep because the dream feels safer than the truth. They'd rather feel in control than feel alive. They'd rather be right than be real. They'd rather stay wounded than risk the unknown. Because awakening is expensive. It will cost you every illusion that made you feel safe. So they go on living in fragments. The achiever who hides an unloved child. The caretaker who's terrified of being alone. The perfectionist who believes they're never enough. The intellect who uses thoughts to escape feeling. They function. They succeed. But underneath they're starving. For truth. For softness. For rest. And the soul begins to ache. Not because something is wrong, but because something sacred is being ignored. The unconscious doesn't punish you. It mourns you. Every time you betray your truth to be accepted. Every time you swallow your words to avoid rejection. Every time you abandon your own needs to feel useful. The unconscious mourns the life you could have lived if you had been whole. And it waits not with judgment, but with longing, waiting for you to come home. But this home is not comfort. It's confrontation. The confrontation of every lie you believed about yourself, that you are too much, that you are not enough, that your needs are dangerous, that your voice is a threat. These are not truths, they are adaptations. They were necessary once, but now they are prisons. And the key has always been the same awareness. To see clearly, to sit with yourself, to ask, whose voice is this? Whose belief is this? Whose fear am I carrying? And then to choose differently, to respond instead of react, to pause instead of project, to feel instead of flee. That is how the unconscious becomes conscious, not in one grand moment, but in 1,000 small choices. Every time you tell the truth, every time you stay when you want to run, every time you meet a trigger with curiosity instead of judgment. It's not about healing perfectly. It's about relating differently. It's about becoming the parent your inner child needed. Becoming the partner your wounded heart deserves. Becoming the self you abandoned in your rush to survive. You don't need to destroy the unconscious. You need to listen to it. And in listening, you make it sacred. Jung said wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration. Integration means you don't leave parts of yourself behind anymore. The rage, the fear, the grief, the tenderness, they all come with you. Not as burdens, but as wisdom. As proof that you were never broken, only fragmented. And that those fragments can return. Not by force, not by will, but by love. Because that's what this entire journey has been about. Not mastery, not success, not even healing. But returning to yourself. To the self before the wound. To the self after the wound. To the self that holds both. The you that remembers what it means to live from the inside out. So if you've heard something here that felt familiar, it's because it's already in you. The knowing, the depth, the questions you couldn't name, the ache you couldn't place. That was never weakness. That was never confusion. That was the unconscious calling you, asking you to look, asking you to listen, asking you to remember. What happens if nothing changes? You stay asleep. You chase the same people, repeat the same pain. You keep calling it fate. You keep calling it life. But what happens if you do change? If you wake up, you begin again. Not as a blank slate, but as someone who knows. Someone who sees. Someone who no longer fears the depths because they've walked through them. This is not the end. This is the threshold, the beginning of an honest life, the beginning of integration, the beginning of you. Welcome back. Why you feel broken and why that's the beginning of wholeness. There's a silence inside you that doesn't feel peaceful. It's the kind of silence that hums like an old wound, not loud but persistent. It shows up in the middle of the night when your body is still, but your mind won't stop echoing the same thought, something's wrong with me. You don't say it out loud. You smile, you work, you laugh when expected. But beneath the surface, you carry the quiet ache of not being whole. You sense it when someone gets too close. You pull back not because you don't want connection, but because a part of you believes you're not worthy of being truly seen. If they looked too closely, they'd see the mess behind the mask. The cracks you've carefully painted over. The fear. The shame. The deep and unspeakable question, am I broken? Most people will tell you no. They'll hand you quick comforts, you're enough. You're perfect as you are. But you know they're not telling you the truth. Because deep down, you felt the fracture. And not in some abstract way, but in the trembling moment you were abandoned. In the way your chest tightened when someone said they loved you and you didn't believe it. In the way you've sabotaged your own peace because comfort felt unfamiliar. You don't feel broken because you're delusional. You feel broken because something inside you is fragmented, and the most dangerous thing you could do is pretend it's not. Carl Jung once wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." That's where the real sickness begins, not in the brokenness itself, but in the war against it. You've been taught to fear your wounds, to hide your suffering, to treat pain like weakness. But what if your brokenness isn't your enemy? What if it's the only doorway to something deeper? There's a hidden cost to pretending. When you deny your inner fracture, it doesn't disappear. It simply goes underground. It seeps into your relationships, your ambitions, your sense of identity. You begin living from the outside and sculpting an image while your inner life decays. You become polished but hollow, smiling but suffocated. And you wonder why intimacy terrifies you, why you feel numb, empty, or secretly unworthy. But you don't trace it back to the wound. You just keep running until life forces you to stop. For many, that moment comes as a collapse. The relationship ends. The career fails. The mask slips. And suddenly, all the unresolved pain surges forward like floodwater. You feel raw, exposed, broken open. And the temptation is to escape through distraction, through performance, through another temporary fix. But here's the truth. No one tells you this collapse is not the end of your life. It's the beginning of your actual one. Because what breaks you is also what brings you back to yourself. To feel broken is not a pathology. It is the psyche's final cry for truth. A call to return to the places within you that were never fully accepted. And this isn't poetic metaphor. It's psychological reality. According to Jung, the self is not born whole. It must be forged, and that forging does not happen through perfection, it happens through integration. through confronting the shadow, through descending into the places you've disowned. When something in you breaks, it is not necessarily because you've failed. It's often because you've reached the edge of who you were never meant to remain. The self you built was a survival strategy. You learned to adapt to what your family expected, what society rewarded, what pain taught you to avoid. But eventually, the persona no longer fits. It begins to crack. And those cracks feel like death. But they are a kind of birth. The birth of a new interior honesty. One that no longer clings to the performance of being okay, but begins the slow and sacred work of becoming real. You feel broken because part of you is breaking. But what's breaking is not your soul, it's the shell. The defenses, the false stories, the inherited guilt, the identities that were never truly yours, the unbearable pressure to be something you're not. To feel broken is to be initiated. It is a descent into the raw basement of the self where the real work begins. Not healing as in fixing, but healing as in re-owning, remembering, reintegrating what has been left behind. It is painful, terrifying. But it is not the end. It's the beginning of wholeness. You don't become whole by ignoring your fractures. You become whole by walking straight into them, by allowing yourself to feel what you were never allowed to feel, to face what you were conditioned to avoid. What breaks you is often not the pain itself, but the refusal to feel it. You were taught to be strong, to stay positive, to get over it. But no one told you that healing begins in the dark. Jung called this descent confronting the shadow, the part of ourselves that contains everything we've rejected, hidden, or denied. Not just the dark urges, but the grief you weren't allowed to express. The rage you swallowed to keep the peace. The needs you silenced to be loved. The voice inside that said, "This hurts," and was told, "Don't be dramatic." Over time, you learned to silence that voice. And now you can't hear it anymore. But it hasn't gone away. It's been waiting beneath every emotional numbness, behind every panic spiral, inside every self-sabotage. You don't feel broken because something is wrong with you. You feel broken because your wholeness is trying to emerge, and the false self is resisting. Pain is not just pain. It is also a messenger, a language. It speaks of a deeper reality. When you finally stop running and listen, it begins to reveal the map back to the self. But only if you can resist the urge to numb, to fix, to perform. The healing doesn't happen in solutions. It happens in the quiet surrender to what is. Nietzsche once said, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." The chaos you carry, the confusion, the sadness, the unexplainable ache, it is not a sign that you're lost. It is a womb, a liminal space between the self you performed and the self that is possible. But you cannot reach that possibility by forcing it. You reach it by allowing what has been buried to surface. This is the hidden nature of transformation. It begins with ruin. You must allow the structures you've clung to collapse, the beliefs that kept you small, the false images you wore for protection, the rigid standards you could never live up to. Wholeness requires that the old version of you dies, and it will feel like you are dying too. Because a part of you is. The ego will panic. It will say, "You are falling apart." But the soul knows better. It whispers, "No, you are falling together." But you must be willing to let the mask rot in your hands. Because behind every broken feeling is something sacred, the original self, untouched by shame. The child who didn't yet believe they had to earn love. The soul that hasn't been distorted by performance. The part of you that remembers, that still feels, that still longs, and that still knows what truth feels like. This is the tragedy and the miracle. Most people only meet that part of themselves after everything collapses. After the betrayal, the loss, the silence, the breakdown, not because suffering is noble, but because suffering strips away illusions. It humbles the ego. It makes us ask questions we were too proud to ask before. Like, who am I without their approval? What if I stop performing? What if I tell the truth about what I feel? These questions aren't signs of weakness. They are signs that you are awakening. Because the real wound is not the pain. The real wound is the abandonment of your own inner world. The moment you stopped listening to yourself, that's what must be repaired. And that repair will not come from someone else completing you. It will not come from a savior. It will not come from fixing what's broken. It will come from sitting beside the brokenness with compassion. From witnessing the parts you've exiled and whispering you are allowed to exist. Adler once said, "The only normal people are the ones you don't know very well." Every person walking beside you is carrying something unseen. Every mask hides a story. Your pain does not make you an outlier. It makes you human. But wholeness is not the same as perfection. Wholeness means nothing is left behind. It means the shame is brought into the light, the anger is heard, the fear is honored, the grief is wept. It means you stop trying to fix the self and start reclaiming it. To feel broken is not a curse. It is a crossroads, a sacred invitation to stop abandoning yourself and start remembering who you were before the silence, before the mask, before you learn to feel like too much or not enough. The journey into wholeness does not begin with becoming better. It begins with becoming honest. There comes a moment in the quiet aftermath of collapse when you stop asking how to escape the pain and start asking what it's trying to teach you. That moment is alchemical. It's the pivot from despair to meaning, from unconscious suffering to conscious transformation. And no one can take you there but you. To the world, you may still seem broken. Your smile may be slower. Your ambitions dimmed. You may cry at things that once didn't touch you. But inside, something else is stirring, something truer than happiness. A strange dignity in the way you now carry your sorrow. A kind of depth in your gaze. You are no longer performing. You are becoming. Jung understood this process as individuation in the journey toward becoming a whole human being, not by rising above suffering, but by integrating it. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The unconscious material within us, our traumas, shadows, unmet needs, does not disappear simply because we ignore it. It waits. And when life finally breaks us open, it pours out not to punish us, but to be known, felt, and ultimately transformed. What you're going through is not regression. It is revelation. You're not falling apart. You're finally becoming aware of how fractured you've been all along. And awareness is the first light of healing. The soul does not want you to patch yourself back together in haste. It wants you to really see the pieces. Because only then can they be reassembled with truth, not illusion. Your suffering, if held consciously, becomes a fire that burns away the false. Not all suffering is transformative. Some becomes bitterness. But suffering, honored suffering faced, becomes a sacred threshold. It purifies. It humbles. It teaches you what no book or teacher ever could, the value of inner truth over outer approval. The necessity of authenticity over conformity. the power of being who you are, even if it costs you everything that once made you feel safe. Most people will never understand this kind of rebirth. They will ask why you've changed. They'll want the old version of you, the agreeable one, the productive one, the invulnerable one. But the old version of you was a prison with soft walls. It gave you comfort, but not freedom. And you are not here to live as a shadow of yourself. You are here to become something whole. Wholeness means you stop splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. It means the child who cried too much is welcomed. The teenager who raged is forgiven. The adult who feels lost is not shamed, but listened to. It means sitting in the fire of your own humanity without flinching. This is the medicine you were never given permission to be exactly as you are. And when you begin to accept that permission, something incredible happens. The world does not change, but your relationship to it does. You stop chasing validation. You stop fearing your own truth. You begin speaking not to be liked, but to be real. You begin choosing not for security, but for alignment. You begin living not from fear, but from center. And this perhaps is what wholeness truly is, not a life without pain, but a life where the pain has meaning, where the suffering you endured becomes the soil of your authenticity, where your most broken moments become the birthplaces of your strength. You don't have to go back to who you were. You don't need to rebuild the mask. The person you're becoming is not fragile. They're forged, not in comfort, but in fire, not in illusion, but in truth. And though you may still feel broken at times, you're beginning to carry that brokenness with wisdom, with courage, with a heart that no longer wants to escape, but to understand. This is how wholeness begins. Not with control, but with surrender. Not with answers, but with honesty. Not with perfection, but with presence. There will come a day when you no longer ask, "How do I fix myself?" But instead, what part of me have I not yet allowed to exist? That is the final threshold. That's the quiet reckoning where you stop chasing wholeness as a goal and begin realizing it as a process already unfolding through your willingness to face what hurts. The world will still try to sell you perfection, self-improvement, endless growth. But the deeper part of you will know the real work is not in becoming more, but in becoming real. You will start to notice the subtle shift. You'll sit with emotions you used to run from. You'll tell the truth in conversations where you once wore masks. You'll walk away from what numbs you and move toward what stirs something alive in your chest, even if it scares you. You will not be healed in the way culture sells healing. You will still tremble. You will still grieve. But you will grieve consciously, and that makes all the difference. Pain met with presence no longer owns you. It moves through you, teaches you, and then leaves you more whole than it found you. The version of you that felt broken was never beyond repair. It was simply waiting for you to stop abandoning yourself in search of outside salvation. And now you've stopped. You've turned inward. You've listened to the voice you silenced for years, the voice that doesn't shout but whispers, "I am still here." And in that voice is everything you thought you lost: your strength, your clarity, your depth, your sacred defiance against everything that ever taught you to reject yourself. You are not perfect. You are not healed in the way you imagined. But you are whole. In the only way that matters, you are no longer at war with yourself. The battle to appear fine has ended. The performance has been laid down. And in its place stands something ancient and human and utterly unshakable as self that no longer needs to be worthy because it already is. a self that no longer needs to be seen because it sees itself. This is not the triumphant end. This is the beginning of a life lived from truth, from integrity, from presence. And though the world may not celebrate this quiet return to yourself, your soul will, because you have chosen to remember what most people spend their whole lives avoiding, that the feeling of being broken was not a curse, but a call. And wholeness was never about becoming someone new. It was about coming home to what was always there, beneath the wounds, behind the shame, inside the silence. And now finally you have returned. You are not just your ego, the hidden self beneath the mask. There is a moment, quiet and unannounced, when you catch yourself in the mirror, not checking your hair, not posing, not pretending, just seeing, and something feels off. You look at your face, but it doesn't feel like you. It's not fear, not sadness, not anger. It's something deeper. A faint echo. A strange sense that the person you're pretending to be isn't the one who's actually alive inside you. And in that split second, you wonder, who have I become? More urgently, who am I beneath all of this? We live most of our lives behind a carefully constructed face, a psychological mask we call the ego. It is not evil. It is not false. It is a necessary fiction, formed from memory, reward, rejection, praise, and pain, shaped by parents, teachers, influencers, algorithms. It speaks with the voice we've been taught is acceptable, the voice that wins approval, avoids rejection, gets results. And over time, we mistake this mask for the totality of who we are. But this voice is not the only voice within us. And if we listen closely enough, especially in those moments when the world goes quiet, we hear something ancient beneath it. Something unpolished, irrational, raw, and deeply real. Carl Jung called this the self, the totality of the conscious and the unconscious psyche. The ego is only the tip of the iceberg, the visible portion of who you think you are. But beneath that lies the shadow, the forgotten, the repressed, the unexpressed. Your unlived lives, your denied emotions, the wild intelligence that exists outside the rigid boundaries of social identity. Most people are afraid of this hidden self. It doesn't always say what's appropriate. It doesn't play by the rules of your performance. But it carries a truth the ego cannot touch. Because the ego isn't built for wholeness. It's built for survival. And you? You are not here merely to survive. You feel the exhaustion of pretending, the hollow performance of being okay, the ache of not being seen even by those closest to you. That is not weakness. That is not depression. That is a signal, a soul-level alarm. It means you're out of alignment, that your ego has overreached, drowned out your deeper self, and now you are paying the price in confusion, disconnection, and quiet despair. You weren't born to live as a character in a play you didn't write. You were born to uncover what is real. But to do that, you have to look beneath the mask to meet the part of you that your social self would rather ignore. This is not a spiritual cliché or motivational metaphor. It's psychological necessity. Jung warned that the more the unconscious is ignored, the more it influences us without our knowledge. What you repress becomes what controls you, and the ego is a master of repression. It silences what doesn't fit its image. But silence is not integration, and denial is not healing. If anything, the more you suppress the true self beneath, the more symptoms begin to emerge: numbness, anxiety, compulsions, relationships that feel like repetition rather than love. And somewhere inside it all is the vague but persistent feeling that something is missing. You may have achieved things, You may be praised, loved, envied even. But if you've built your life on a version of yourself that doesn't include your inner truth, then all that success is built on sand. You feel the collapse coming. You sense the emptiness in the smiles, the dissonance in your days. That is yourself not sabotaging you, but trying to awaken you. Not to tear you down, but to invite you back to your real center, your unmasked being, the one you abandoned to play the part of who you thought you should be. The problem is not the ego. The problem is that you've forgotten it's a mask. And once the mask becomes fused to your identity, you begin to lose the ability to hear anything deeper. You laugh at things that don't move you. You agree with things that don't resonate. You stay in places that suffocate you. And worst of all, you start to lie to yourself. The lie doesn't sound dramatic. It's subtle. I'm fine. This is just how life is. Other people have it worse. These phrases aren't coping mechanisms. They are tiny deaths. Each one a quiet retreat from the truth you haven't yet dared to face, that the life you're living might not be your own. So who's living in the shadows of your daily performance? Who is screaming behind the smile? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the beginning of your return. Because until you begin to reconnect with the self beneath the mask, the hidden, rejected, truer you will always feel fractured, always feel slightly outside your own life. The truth is, you are not just your ego. You are not the story you tell people. You are not the person who posts, performs, pleases. You are something deeper, something vast. And if you're brave enough, you can meet it, but not without cost. To begin unmasking yourself is not a graceful act. It is not pretty. It is not shareable. It is not something you can perform or post. It is solitary, often ugly, and almost always terrifying. Because the moment you stop over-identifying with your ego is the moment everything you've used to define yourself begins to unravel. And this unraveling is necessary, because you cannot find your true self while clinging to the false one. You have to lose the mask, and with it you may lose the life it built. You start to question things you once accepted without thought. The job that exhausts you, the friends that don't know the real you, the beliefs that feel more inherited than chosen. And what begins as quiet discomfort turns into a slow internal revolution. Your habits feel foreign. Your laughter feels distant. You wake up and realize, I don't know who I am anymore. But here's the paradox, that moment of disorientation, that crisis of identity, is not the end. It is the door. Because only when the false self breaks can the deeper self begin to speak. Nietzsche once wrote, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. The chaos he speaks of is not dysfunction. It is the sacred disorder that emerges when a person begins to undo the conditioning of their ego and rediscover the truth underneath. This process is often mistaken for collapse, but it is not. It is confrontation with your past, with your wounds, with the memories you buried because you thought they made you unlovable. The ego avoids all of this. The self demands it. Because healing cannot happen without remembering, and freedom cannot happen without truth. So many people want transformation without loss. They want to evolve without letting anything die. But psychological rebirth is not additive. It is destructive first. You don't build the true self by stacking new affirmations on top of old trauma. You build it by burning the illusion, by walking through the fire of what you've refused to feel. Shame, rage, grief, envy, emptiness. These are not enemies. They are signals, indicators of where the self is trapped beneath layers of protection and performance. And until you feel them without judgment or justification, you will never be whole. You will be nice, you will be functional, you will be accepted, but you will not be free. Alfred Adler once observed that every neurotic is trying to solve the problem of self-esteem by living for other people. The ego thrives on this. It builds itself around the imagined gaze of others. Your entire identity becomes a performance for an invisible audience. But here's the truth. No one tells you the audience isn't real. The judgment you fear is internal. The standards you chase are inherited. The mask you wear was carved from the expectations of people who were wearing their own masks. You are not obligated to continue the illusion, but unmasking is painful. Not just because it threatens what you've built, but because it forces you to see what you've lost. How many years did you waste playing a role? How many moments of real connection did you avoid? Because vulnerability felt unsafe, how many parts of yourself did you exile just to belong? These questions aren't asked to shame you. They're asked to awaken you. Because the cost of maintaining the mask is your life. Your real life. The one you glimpse in dreams in silence, in those rare moments when the noise dies down and something ancient inside you whispers, "This isn't who we are." And it's right. Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires the integration of the unconscious into the conscious mind. It's not enough to understand the self intellectually. You must embody it, live it, risk being it, even when it costs you comfort. The self is not a philosophy. It is a fire. It will burn through the false identities you've built. It will dismantle the lies you told to survive. It will call you to places you do not yet understand, because it is not concerned with safety. It is concerned with truth. And if you are serious about becoming whole, if you are done pretending, done performing, done shrinking, and then you must prepare for war, not with the world, not with others, but with the part of you that resists change. The inner saboteur, the defender of the mask. It will tell you that this is foolish, that people won't accept the real you, that your pain is too much your truth, too dark your dreams, too unrealistic. And in a way, it's right. Not everyone will accept you, but the self does not need universal acceptance. It only needs yours. So the question becomes, are you willing to lose who you think you are, to become who you truly are? Most people never answer that question. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack depth, but because they're afraid of what the answer will cost them. The mask is familiar, the ego is efficient, and the world rewards the persona that conforms. So they keep living someone else's idea of a life. They mistake busyness for purpose, numbness for peace, approval for love. And beneath it all, the hidden self waits quietly, patiently, until the silence grows unbearable, until the ache of inauthenticity becomes louder than the fear of change. There's a kind of spiritual violence in pretending. Not dramatic, not visible, but slow and soul-eroding. Every time you bite your tongue instead of speaking your truth. Every time you downplay your depth to avoid being too much. Every time you shrink to fit into spaces that were never meant for the real you. It is a self-betrayal so quiet, so socially acceptable, that you don't even realize you're doing it. Until one day you do. And then the grief hits. Not just for what was done to you, but for what you did to yourself in order to belong. And this grief is sacred. You must allow it to move through you. Because until you mourn the life you were forced to live, you will never feel worthy of the one that is waiting to be born. It is not weakness to cry for your lost self. It is not indulgent to grieve the years you wore a mask. It is necessary. Transformation begins with truth, but truth must pass through the body. The ego wants to think its way out of suffering. The self wants to feel its way through. There is no bypass. There is no shortcut. There is only the descent into shadow, into memory, into the disowned parts of your psyche that still wait to be held. Jung spoke often of this descent, the confrontation with the unconscious, as the essential gateway to psychological integration. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You do not reclaim yourself by running toward some idealized version of who you could be. You reclaim it by walking back into the parts of yourself you were taught to hide. The anger, the fear, the wildness, the hunger, the innocence. These are not enemies. They are fragments of your being that were never given permission to exist. But here's what no one tells you: when you begin to integrate those parts, when you stop running from them and begin to listen, you don't become more chaotic. You become more whole, more rooted, more alive. The shadow doesn't corrupt the self. It completes it. And the parts of you that once seemed dangerous or embarrassing or unacceptable begin to show their sacred function. Your anger becomes your boundary. Your fear becomes your humility. Your desire becomes your compass. Your sadness becomes your depth. The very things you were taught to suppress become the pillars of your authenticity. But none of this is possible if you're still clinging to the mask. And make no mistake, the mask will fight to stay on. It will whisper that you're going too far, that people won't understand, that you'll end up alone. But let's be honest. Haven't you already felt alone? Haven't you already lived that quiet exile, surrounded by people yet unseen, performing yet hollow, achieving yet unfulfilled? That's not connection. That's captivity. And you are allowed to leave it behind. You are allowed to outgrow the version of you that others have accepted. You are allowed to change, even if it disappoints people, even if it scares them, even if it costs you relationships that were only ever based on your performance. Because if love is based on your mask, it is not love. It is approval, and approval is conditional. It is earned, manipulated, maintained. But the self, the real self, is not here to be approved of. It is here to be expressed. You don't have to abandon everything overnight. This is not a call to recklessness. It is a call to honesty. One breath at a time. One truth at a time. Begin with silence. Begin with stillness. Ask yourself without agenda, without performance, what part of me have I forgotten? Then listen. Not to fix, not to explain, just to witness. That is the beginning of reintegration, of becoming not just a functioning ego, but a complete human being. Because ultimately, you are not just the part of you that others can see. You are not just your thoughts, your roles, your routines. You are not the sum of your social performance. You are the silence behind your speech, the witness behind your thoughts, the life behind the image. And that life, that unnameable, untouched aliveness, is the self, your real identity. Not the mask, but the face beneath it. And once you remember that, nothing can own you again. There comes a moment in every inner journey when the question changes. It's no longer, who am I beneath the mask? But rather, what will I lose if I keep wearing it? This is the reckoning, not dramatic, not cinematic, but deeply human. Because the longer you live as a version of yourself disconnected from your truth, the more your soul begins to erode. not all at once. Slowly, quietly, like a house that still looks intact from the outside. But the foundation is rotting. The walls are cracking. And deep down, you know it won't hold forever. You think you have time. Time to heal. Time to change. Time to finally say what you really mean. But time doesn't wait for your readiness. The more you delay this work, the work of becoming who you really are, the more your life becomes a script written by fear. You stay in the relationship that feels safe, but dead. You keep the job that drains your life force. You pretend to believe things that no longer make sense to you. And the price you pay is not just emotional. It's existential. You begin to die while still alive. This is not poetic exaggeration. It's psychological reality. The death of the self doesn't come with violence or screams. It comes with silence. It comes when you stop feeling deeply. When the days blur. When nothing moves you. When you laugh because you're supposed to cry because you're exhausted, smile because it's expected. And you wonder why life feels hollow. Why you can't connect. Why nothing feels real. But the answer has always been the same. You abandoned yourself. And now yourself is fading. The final tragedy of the unexamined life is not regret. It's forgetfulness. You forget what joy feels like without performance. You forget what love feels like without fear. You forget what it means to simply exist, not as a role, not as a persona, but as a presence, a living truth. And once that forgetfulness sets in, the mask becomes your face. You no longer remember that you were once something else, something freer, something fuller. And that is the greatest loss of all, not the life you could have had, but the self you could have become. But if you're still watching this, you haven't forgotten completely. There's a pulse inside you, a whisper, a quiet but unkillable longing to return, not to the past, but to yourself. The one you buried, the one you silenced, the one who still watches you from the mirror, hoping that one day you'll remember, that you'll choose to come home, because that's what this is. Not a breakthrough, not a transformation, but a return to the center, to the source, to the part of you that never needed fixing, only uncovering. So, what remains if you choose the self, not perfection, not ease, not universal love and admiration? No. But what remains is truth. And truth is enough. Truth is what your nervous system has been aching for. Truth is what your relationships have been starving for. Truth is what your purpose is made of. It's not loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't plead. It simply is. And once you align with it, you begin to feel real again. Grounded, whole. Not because your life is perfect, but because it's yours. When you live from the self, you no longer need to prove your worth. You no longer chase love. You no longer fear the gaze of others. You no longer negotiate with your own aliveness. You simply move from truth. And the people who resonate will stay. The people who don't were never meant to witness your becoming. This is not a journey for the faint-hearted. The path of deconstructing the ego and reclaiming the self will ask more of you than you thought you could give. It will test your loyalty to your own soul. It will strip you of every illusion you clung to for comfort. But in its place, it will give you something unshakable: your life. Not borrowed, not inherited, yours. So now the final question is not about the ego, not about the mask. It's about you. Are you willing to remember who you were before the world told you who to be? Because yourself is still waiting. And it always will be until you say yes.